This is what I call working with the colour of a photo. To get the end product, I base my colour choices on the original photo's colour palette, and then I use some textures and colour grading techniques or colour choices to get this end result. What I'm going to do is break down the layers, share some of the techniques and my colour choices as I went along. I'll just go in, turn all my layers off. That's the original photo, taken on a back road in New Zealand. It had just started to snow, and as we were driving past, there was this lovely road. I think what made me stop was this tree. It's certainly got some character, but this is the colour palette that I'm going to work with. I've extended the canvas here because I wasn't too sure what I was going to do with the composition. And you'll see as I go through my workflow what I did to address this area here. So the first layer that I went into Nik software and chose Analog Effects. I'll turn that layer on. It's what I call flattened or muted the colours, but it's a good base now to build up my colour. The next layer was the curves. I did a little bit of tweaking in the highlights and the midtones and a little bit in the dark. The next layer is where I changed my composition using the transform tool with scale. Turn that layer on. And so it made the composition come closer, and I wanted the viewer to feel as though they were standing on that road looking down and looking at this beautiful tree. I have to fix that up and I will work on that later. The next two layers is where I've worked on some luminosity masking, and I've played with my midtones and shadows to give them a little bit of a boost. There's my midtones, there's my shadows. Turn them off, turn them on. Now the next layer is where I use a texture. I'll turn the layer on and explain why I chose this texture, because it was a colour choice. And I'll turn it on. Now, when you think of a texture overlay, you think that there's a lot of grunge or texture in it, but I choose textures for colour that may not have a lot of that grungy look or surface appearance. But have a look at it here. It's very much a light colour, and so I wanted to even the colour and the tones and the shadows across the image, and so I will often use a texture to do that. You could use the levels, you could use the curves, you could use a solid colour fill. Like anything in Photoshop, there's many ways to do it. My next layer is the stamp visible layer. Now I'm looking at it and I feel that it's a little bit flat in its tones and depth of colour, so I'm going to even it out before I use more textures. So there's my favourite grey. It's a solid colour fill. I'll click on that. You can see it's just given it a little bit of a lift. I'll go to the blend mode, soft light, and opacity is at 50%. This is where now I'm starting to use what I call a texture overlay, and it gives the effect of snow. And this texture was created from sand granules. And I photographed lots of textures, lots of different things, and you'd be surprised what you can do with them. So I put that first texture on and it gives the illusion of snow. I've done a stamp visible. Then I've added another snow and I've made it small. So I'm building up the snow again. This layer here is where I've done a little bit of, not masking, the luminosity masking, just to give it a little bit of tone down. Have a look. And there it is there. I've added another snow layer. I've done a little bit of brushing in some contrast. You can see just on the road edges there. And my colour build-up and colour choices are quite small and subtle. So if I come up and look at the opacity, it's on 40%. The next layer is where I've done some burn to give some depth, and I always do a dodge and burn on a 50% grey layer as it's not destructive, so I'll turn that layer on. So I've done depth in certain areas, and you can see where I've brushed that in. Now I look at it and I'll go, okay, it needs a little bit of brightness, let's try that. So I've just done a little bit of tweaking, and I've actually dropped the brightness down by -5. I'll turn that layer off and turn it on. So as I mentioned before, with my workflow, I will build up colour or light or tone or tint, and then I tone it down and then I build it up again. And that's how I get my depth in colour and tone. My next layer is where I whacked in some birds. I've done many versions of this. I've added birds, I've added a deer at the end, I've also put a cloud up here, and I've made it into a triptych. And the award-winning image that did well in a number of comps was a triptych. And so it's a good base image that you can play with to create different versions. My next layer is where I've done a little bit of colour tone down. I'll turn that layer off and turn it on. Now, when I created this image, I didn't name some of the layers, and so that's why I get into the housekeeping now of naming my layers, because when I turn that layer off and on, I'll look at the layer and I'll go, well, I have no idea what I did on that layer, but I liked it. So the tip for you is get into the habit of naming the layers, the technique. So, for example, birds. It could be here that I used a curves layer or a levels adjustment layer. Next layer, I'll turn that on. That's a stamp visible layer. Now, I'm not happy with the depth of colour. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll use a lookup table, turn that on and turn it off. It's subtle, but I'll click on that layer. Let's have a look. The opacity is at 66%. So I've just dialed it down a little bit. Now what I've done is another stamp visible layer. I'm getting towards the end now. I'll do a glamour glow in Nick to make it a little bit more softer. I'll do another Nick, and that gives it some depth in there. And it's one of the filters. And again, I can't remember what filter I created on that, but I turn that layer off and on, and it's now you can see the depth of colour is coming through all the lightness. I've done again some burn just on the road edges there. Now, this is where I'll take the birds out and have a look, and I go, oh, do I like the birds? Do I not like the birds? Oh, let's see what I'll do. I'll put the birds back in. Now I've fixed that area there. Now there's a line there, and I know that, and I would fix that up, and I did. With these layers, I've taken out a few of the layers that I've created to get the final product so I could speed this through for you. But my finishing touch was a gradient fill in some greys. I'll turn that on, and it's soft light, and the opacity is at 53%. So if I dialed up that gradient, you can see it's quite bright, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted to have it some depth in the colour, but I also wanted it to be light. Now, when I look back at this image, all it was based on was colour choices. When I added some light, adding in some textures that would give it a light appearance. But from starting from this image here to the full image where I've created this was a combination of colour choices, working with the colour, and some textures to give it that look. Colour is a very important part of my workflow, and it can be with your workflow when you start to understand how colour can work within your images.